Let's talk all about AI in business. It's hosted by Brent Muller. Welcome to the Future Proof Podcast.
Hi, and welcome to Future Proof, the podcast where we're decoding how leaders, execs, and founders are using things like AI, automation, data to work smarter, innovate faster, and really change the landscape of business. If you're looking to future-proof your business, you're definitely in the right place. And I am joined today by Cal Thixton. Cal has an unbelievable background and story, and we're going to start off on how he got ordered by Steve Jobs to move to Chicago. So, Cal, welcome, and thanks for sharing some of your insights today.
Afternoon, sir. Yes, I like to claim I brought Steve Jobs and the internet to Chicago years ago. But no, I was at Sun Microsystems when I got inherited by this guy that nobody really knows too well. But he told me to come out to San Francisco one time to go meet this guy that he met, and so I'm out, in Deer Creek, in the lobby waiting to meet this guy. And I was at Sun. We were converting Sun from a $40 million company to a $2 billion corporation, EDS, Ross Perot, and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I ended up having this conversation with this guy, argument, debate, whatever. My boss was kind of trying to tell me to chill it, Cal, because I had my sort of worldview on the nature of computing. After 20 minutes, my boss was sitting here giving me a dirty look like, I hope you didn't mess this up, Cal. But he came back down half an hour later and had a signed offer letter from Steve Jobs for me to come work for him, and effectively wanted me to move to Pittsburgh because we had just started up a relationship with Carnegie Mellon's Robotics Institute and Raj Reddy, and had indoctrinating the mock kernel that came from Carnegie Mellon. If you ever heard of a young man named Avi Tavanian, he was a grad student at Carnegie Mellon at the time and became one of Steve's first hires, which was the core of iOS on your iPhone. So this grad student moved to California to work for Steve. I moved to Carnegie Mellon because we were still this is Next Computers, by the way, not Apple.
Right.
So when Steve got kicked out of Apple, 5,000 people ran him out the front door because he was being a jerk. He started up Next Computers to kind of prove that he wasn't an accident the first time, and went around and spent time trying to figure out what the next thing he was going to do. And one of the things he came across was the work at Carnegie Mellon with the ARPANET funding research that was going on at the time for operating systems and stuff. Met Avi, and basically started up Next, and we started up Next Step, and came up with a computer, a hardware, a workstation like a Sun equivalent, but it was a totally different approach to coming up with a Windows-based, platform. Anyway, I got brought in, to help, facilitate the technology transfer between both sides. I was there for about 2 years. I bought a house. I loved it. 7 bedroom, 5 baths, 11 fireplaces, and an average house in Pittsburgh. And basically was flying back to California about every other week, and facilitating the conversation between the two. 2 years later, I get a call from Steve because he was shutting down Pittsburgh and told me to move to Chicago. I still wanted to work for him. So I did. And I ended up here in Wicker Park, which is just a little ways from downtown. But for the next 5 years, we were basically helping the Board of Trade create arbitrage, because the first arbitrage trading platform was based on Next Step and Objective-C, and was deployed to, I believe, Hong Kong, if I remember right. But when they did, it was broken, and they couldn't figure out why it wasn't working, because it worked at the Board of Trade, but not halfway across the planet. So I get called in, and I was usually the guy that got brought in to fix stuff that was really broken for some strange reason. And because I knew people like Avi, I knew all the smart people in California, I could act as a bridge to figure out how to, narrow down and debug it. And we got it figured out. It was actually not too hard of a problem, IP packet fragmentation, but we fixed it. They deployed it. I was a superhero. Dwight Coop called up Steve Jobs and said, "Oh, Cal was our superhero." And we got arbitrage created, which is now $1 billion, platform of trading these days. Same thing with Abbott Labs. We helped create the first clinical lab integration platform back in the day. If you ever had your blood tested and all the fluids, all these little machines are little autonomous little boxes. They don't talk to each other and no common database. And so we put together something called a Maestro platform, and about a $10 million project that Apple that was based on Next and called Maestro. We helped all these trading platforms like O'Connor Brothers, who did the arbitrage platform, deploy. The Board of Trade that got finally hooked up to the internet and started doing international trading. The arbitraging platform is also the first attempt to help with the opening and closing of the markets throughout the planet and helping money stay active in trading in order to help develop wealth. And that was one of the things that arbitrage was good for, because the when the London Stock Exchange shut down, New York would open up, and it wasn't so easy like getting money from one exchange to another,
Right,
to another,
right.
to another. And that was one of the things that the internet helped with and arbitraging helped with, was to make the flow of money a 24-hour event, throughout that time.
Right.
Other projects that we ended up doing, aside from medical and financial, were all based on trying to bring object-oriented programming thinking, to a new challenge. When Steve started to go get sucked back into Apple, I didn't want to move to California. So I opened up an ISP here in Chicago, all based on Next Step computers at the time. We built
Right.
the first Olympic website for Salt Lake City Winter Olympics. If you go to olympics.adrency.com, you can see what an old website looked like 30 years ago. A little boring, but still very innovative in its day.
Yeah, in its day,
But
right? Yeah.
yeah, it was
Yeah.
bloody amazing. The artwork is nice. Interaction, it's not quite responsive design like you have today, but it was the first website in production for the Olympics ever. We had it up back in
And that was
90.
for Salt Lake?
It's for Salt Lake, the
Yeah.
2001 Winter Olympics, but we built it like in 97, 98 sometime, and we hosted it on the Next Step computer. But one of the things I used to get in arguments with Steve was that he felt like the workstation was for human interaction, not for hosting websites. I kind of
Right.
pushed him into the idea that websites, we need to host the websites as well as build the websites. And so I got into arguments with him all the time about some of this stuff, because like with the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics, there was so much traffic. I actually hosted in my basement here in Wicker Park. I had fiber pulled to my house back in the day, if you want to see the big cables that are still to my house in the back alley. But the sorry, old friend of mine calling. The traffic was so high, it was crashing the next computer all the time. So what we ended up doing was I had it on a Sun workstation, which is hardier at hosting high volumes of traffic. But
Right.
it got me into an argument with Steve, because here I was wanting to get the latest frameworks, from Berkeley into the next release, so that we could host things like the Olympics website on the
Right.
next computer and not have it crash. So, so my argument with Steve was, on a Next, it crashes. We have 100,000 visitors an hour, and it just can't handle it. I have it on Sun Workstation, and it was doing great. And here
Right.
I was transitioning from Next to Thoughtport, our company at the time,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the reasons how I got the phone call from Steve saying he'd come hook up Davy Symphony to the internet for me so that I can do a demonstration. And so in front of 5,000 people on a Next workstation based on a WebObjects application that got built to interact with United Airlines, he booked the first airlines reservation in front of 5,000 people in real time. And then he picked up his phone, called United, and spoke to some random operator and confirmed the reservation in real time in front of 5,000
Really
people.
cool. Really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. And he called.
And when was this, Cal?
Uh, I was still. I left Next around 97, I think. So it was like
Yeah.
95, I believe. Because
Yeah.
I moved here in 93 or 1992.
Okay.
So it was like, because we spent like a couple of years trying to turn that into a profitable business, because Next went from a hardware company into a software company.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
300 million in revenue with low margins sounds great, but not as profitable as a software company. But even then, we weren't going to be a Microsoft. We
Right.
just couldn't quite figure out how to catch up to Bill Gates, which is really what Steve was trying to do. And that's when he kind of began to realize that um, going back, and because Apple was in such turmoil at this point, they
Yeah.
were begging, they were kind of somebody in marketing said, let's go talk to Steve and see if we can possibly start that conversation up again. So somebody in marketing at Apple came to start talking to somebody in marketing at Next. And that's how they got the big boys kind of talking to each other again. And that's how Steve got his introduction to come back to Apple in a slight indirect way, without begging to come back, but without a direct invite. But it all worked out brilliantly because Apple needed Steve and Steve needed Apple in the end. So because Apple was his baby, but now he's an adolescent, and it was also grown up enough to realize, you know, we don't know everything. We need to have this kind of put back together. And he brings back Cena, my old boss, who was supposed to take over for Steve, but his health wasn't so good, so he didn't want to do it. So then we got Tim Cook, who was running the China connection back in the day, and Tim's done brilliantly. Tim is a good man, but for 15 years after Steve came back, Cena was a VP of apps at Apple. Avi came back to run VP of engineering and took the Mach operating system, and it evolved into what is now iOS on your iPhone, and which is basically a little Unix operating system. Yep. And it used to have some of my own software in there back in the day until they found it and kicked it off. But the point is the software that initially got funded by ARPANET back in the day at Berkeley ran around, went through Sun, went through Next, got into Apple, and now it's on every teenager's little iPhone on the planet. So anybody who's got anybody under 30 these days in their household, they all demand to have iPhones, at least in the United States anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
Including my granddaughters. There's no way to get away from that. So now you've got two markets dealing with mobile app development that you have to kind of deal with. You got the old cranky folks like you and I who want an app to be functional, but it doesn't have to be brilliant and sexy and innovative per se. You just want it to be useful and frank and and easy to understand, like your grandma can use it. And then you got the younger market who wants something cool and sexy and engage with their friends and make them all look good and real time and never off Wi-Fi, but they can always do kind of cool stuff with it. My mobile app work over this last couple of years has been how not only to deal with the fact that the market is fragmented between those two communities. You got the old cranky types like you and I, and then you got the young, innovative young ones who don't care about the tech. They don't know. They're not interested in how it works. They just know how it's cool. They can, look good with their friends and engage with everybody. And whatnot. So what I've been looking for this last year was what the next revolution of doing mobile app development was leading. Because if you notice, the first dev camp in the Midwest was in my living room 15 years ago. Alex Cohn, who was the guy who did the Barnes & Noble Nook app 15 years ago, with his team, a $5 million project back in the day to read a book on your tablet, taught in my living room for a week, how to write mobile apps or how to write in Objective-C for mobile app development. And that was the first one in the Midwest. And I had to move all the furniture out, but we had room for 30 people in my living room. And that was the start of trying to democratize the software development for this platform, because it was trying to get more and more people writing and benefiting from it and being able to sell their own stuff. So one of the nice things about the iTunes, if you remember the evolution of iTunes, was it was the first attempt to let musicians sell their work, claim their artistry and their rights to ownership to the technology and their work, their craft, without record label producers stealing their stuff and getting pennies on the dollar. iTunes, which is what Cena, my old boss, was the sponsor of with Steve, was the first platform to democratize the delivery of proceeds and royalties to the artist community. And then the next step from that was the software developer. Because if you think artists in the music industry had it bad, software developers had it worse, because you had people like Microsoft stealing stuff. Maybe I shouldn't say that. People taking your stuff away, taking your ideas from you and then publishing it, because you really had no easy way of making claim on it. But with the App Store, iTunes evolving into the App Store, you are now able to actually publish your app. And if you've ever been in an Apple approval process with Apple, a lot of the effort with Apple is to make sure you're not stealing someone's idea, you're not selling someone's brand, you're not selling someone's label or whatever. And so you'll spend half of your time convincing them you're not a thief. And then you're going to spend half the other time convincing them it's not boring, dumb, and stupid like breaking rule 3.2.2, which
Yeah.
is documented in Apple's write-ups on how not to write a boring app.
Right.
From there, you get on the platform. Now it's kind of like now it's your territory, and now you can bring on your team and then publish.
Right.
So um, so from that first getting Apple software development started, we've gone through a couple of evolutions on mobile app development. Cross-platform technology. Oh my God, how do you not just do for Apple? How do you do it on Android? How do you do
Right.
it on Windows? How do you do it on other platforms without having to spend another $500,000, $1 million on the efforts? And then how do you leverage off of that technology? Well, so we have things like Flutter. You have Ionic come through, trying to come up with ways of letting you write the code once, but let it be deployed across varying pieces of technology.
Right.
And then, once you can get it across all these technologies, how do you not get strapped into maintaining software for the next 5, 10, 15 years? Because all technology rots. And how do you keep it from rotting? And how do you also kind of keep up with the cool kids on the next evolution?
Right.
So the open source philosophy for writing software emerged around during this time.
Yeah.
And if you're familiar with that, it was the idea that software shouldn't be a closed, it's only mine kind of mentality. It should be shared, supported, encouraged, contributed to by everybody. Everyone kind of gets some support from it, but you're also going to leverage off of the aggregate smarts of the community. So believe it or not, the side benefit there is that now you've got all these frameworks that you can leverage, not having to write Apple or write mobile apps from the ground up, but you could spend more of your time on the concept, the high level, the branding, the look and feel, the interaction, and not be mucking with low level stuff like how the mouse works or the screens, move over or whatever, because you're leveraging off other folks that have already implemented that.
Right.
So the part that you write is the top 20% of the code, even though the average app is still 500,000 lines of software these days. And then your level of effort gets brought down to something a bit more reasonable. The Barnes and my last project, 3FAMs, I got brought in to do QA. I downloaded the code from the repository. I actually got it built on Apple and Android. I sent it over to Test Flight to the big boss. He had a heart attack. He didn't know what Test Flight was. I said, oh, well, just download Test Flight and, take the email I sent you and download the app. He had a heart attack. He promoted me to CTO, in 24 hours. Said, Cal, all the tech is yours now. You just control it all. And I said, okay, fine. And then from there, we actually got the app published in less than a year, which is a fraction. I'm sorry.
No, wow. I mean, it's quick.
But you interrupted me because I was babbling. We managed to get a Cameo equivalent in a fraction of time on a fraction of the budget. And we had 30,000 people download our app within the first couple of days of it getting published. And then, the intent was to host 100,000 people at concerts in real time during COVID. Billable, be able to build people's attendance so they can come see a concert that they can't attend in person because of the stupid virus. So we streamed our first event from France. And one of the things that I was doing, aside from just being a brilliant CTO and getting the tech to actually work, was adding analytics and real-time monitoring of the usage of the app so that the board could actually see what engineering was doing, aside from just getting it running on their phone, but also to do real-time telemetry of usage. Because at the time, one of the things I did was include Google Analytics, and they had real-time mapping so that you could sit there on a web portal with a worldwide map and see everybody that's got your map or has your phone app in real time using your phone, where they're at,
cool.
within reason. And so when we were streaming, like doing the first, Sopranos Cons events, we had all these people on the app. We had like I said, 30,000 people. That's how I know. And the board was having conniption fits. Like, wow, this is like really cool stuff.
No
we could actually
kidding.
see what these people are doing and how they're doing it. And we went through like a couple of rounds of financing before we just kind of ran out of money, because we generated like 5 million our first year, but we needed like 3 times that, for our third round of funding to kind of keep going, but we shut down. But we set several milestones as a result of doing that. So like I said, We implemented a Cameo equivalent in a fraction of time on a fraction of the budget with content. In this case, with Sopranos Con's, sort of genre,
Right.
monetized it across an international um, uh, payment systems because we were using like Stripe and PayPal and whatnot.
Right.
Our single biggest Achilles heel when we were hosting our first event, guess what it was? Guess what our biggest problem was when we went live with our first event?
Bandwidth? I don't know.
Nope, bandwidth was great. It was selling tickets quickly enough because the payment system just could not handle that many purchases in real
Concurrent.
time.
Right.
Yeah, because you go to a concert and everyone's buying tickets from everybody because all the scalpers have already pre-bought tickets and just going up
Right.
and down the line, and everyone's kind of doing the stuff in sort of mixed real time. But that was our biggest challenge, which we got it fixed for the second event. But it was something we didn't really think about, at the time, for our first event. But we got it actually working. The streaming based on Vonage, was doing quite nicely. The data collections at least, gave the big bosses an idea of what was going on.
Right.
It was damn impressive. And we didn't spend all this time trying to come up with the urban perfect stuff. We were just trying to leverage off of reasonable technology and get it out the door and get it up and running. Because you make it perfect and it's never going to make you any money.
The 80-20 rule. So now, Cal, fast forward to what you want to do now with apps, because I feel like all of that led up to kind of what you want to do to help, because you can do these faster. You've learned all these lessons, right?
Yes.
And now you were talking to me about what you want to do for the smaller side of mid-market and the small business, folks with mobile apps.
Well, like you were inquiring earlier about, what are we going to do with AI? How do we make things like that useful to, to the larger market? How do we leverage smaller businesses so they don't think that, mobile apps are only for the rich people to have on the App Store?
Right.
Or get on, the Android into, the Latin markets in like South America or Europe or whatever.
Right.
So we democratized the mobile app development process to kind of bring down the cost of the labor to produce the significantly. So the average app on the App Store is still $100,000. And if it's cool and sexy, it's going to cost you more than that. I did one for my kids' nonprofit here in Chicago. Started up like 15 years ago, runs a radio station, live website based on WordPress. We're doing streaming, real-time 24-hour radio. We did TV streaming last year. And I said, let's do a mobile app for you too. Well, if you go to q4.org, QUE4.org, you'll see there's an Apple app up there, the Apple logo. And effectively what I did was use these new frameworks to take his website and the content, the radio station, including chatting and donations and whatever, and plug it into the mobile app and submit it to Apple and get it published. And like I said, the biggest challenge with Apple is proving that you're not stealing someone's idea, but also making sure it's innovative enough to get published. It's been up there, and now they're getting about a couple of hundred downloads a week. And this is just a small nonprofit here in Chicago, Alf.
Yeah.
And if I had to bill them, maybe 20, 30 grand, maybe of effort to put it together and get it out the door.
Yeah.
What? A mobile app for, less than 6 figures? Oh my God, have a heart attack. I mean, it still needs to be, creative and innovative.
Yeah.
But the idea is let's put all of that work, brain work, branding, navigation, interaction into your website. Everyone does WordPress. Everyone does it on GoDaddy or someplace or Amazon or whatever. Let's get it up there. Let's put your ideas. Let's put the chatting. Let's put the streaming, the engagement, the analytics, the branding, your message into the website. That's 90% of where it's going to be anyway. And with the new frameworks, let's leverage off of that, turn it into a mobile app. So we're not trying to come up with two big, heavy pieces of technology for you just to be with the cool kids, the fancy website and the fancy mobile. We basically leverage one off the other. I mean, it's kind of like, if you remember back in the day, we had outdoor plumbing.
Yeah.
Well, it became innovative to have it indoor, but that was only for the rich folks. Well, then we commoditized it by standardizing the parts and plumbing apparatus because pipes and fixtures and all that.
That's how everything works, right?
Became commoditized items that any plumber could put together. And then it scaled that everyone could leverage it because now it wasn't just something in the royal family's home. It was something that in everyone's home they could afford. Same thing with this kind of approach is trying to make it easier. which kind of makes it a little harder for Apple because now
They have to police it more, but yeah.
they'll have to do a little bit more fleecing on it.
Hmm.
But Apple's not stupid and they're not lazy, but they are trying to be full to Steve's original vision here on helping to lead the innovation world and
Yeah.
help stay
And I
kind of
love
stay
it.
ahead
Now
of it.
you're doing your part, right?
I'm trying.
You're almost at 200 mobile apps developed. I mean, that's amazing.
I've got over 200 apps in test flight. If that means
Yeah.
any, for those who know what that means, they should be shocked or impressed.
Yeah.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
the intent is to put a proof of concept, put a what I call a POC, a proof of concept, in front of a small business owner's hands to take a look at it to see if they like the idea and want to take the next step, and then we can talk about what it would take to do
To
that,
get it there, right?
as well as budget and a
Yeah.
timeline.
Yeah.
And I've got several interested right now. The economy, is a little bit murkier at the moment, but democratizing the development cycle has been, rather working because at least I got the conversation started.
Yeah.
And as the economy starts hopefully beefing up this, the next, few years,
Yep.
this will be an easier thing to do.
Absolutely.
And at least for the U.S. market.
Yep.
The Android market is a little easier to publish on these days, but that's if you're Europe or South America kind of thing,
Yeah.
and other languages. But still, it's an effort to democratize things, as they say, as I like to kind of put it.
Well, I think what you've just kind of highlighted is the fact that this is going to make mobile app for small businesses a reality. That whereas in the past it's been a big lift, very expensive, very time exhaustive, right?
Yes.
And now I think, like you said, it's democratizing, right? If you think about the evolution of the cameras and the high def, and now they're on the phones.
Yep.
Well, the phones. Yeah, and they're unbelievable, right? You can't even imagine a camera like that that's just part of another device you get. So I think this is where AI is helping things like mobile apps come way down.
Exactly. So AI is new and cool, and everyone's trying to figure out how it's going to help us.
Mm-hmm.
Simple engagement, like sucking in all the content of your website and being able to engage with you on a chat to talk about what that website does, is kind of cool. You put enough messaging into your website, and that at least leverages that. Can you talk to it? Can grandma now be able to engage with your app through AI? Yes. Don't think grandma's dumb. She knows a stupid person when she talks to her, but but the intent is to sort of make it simpler. You don't have to be pushing buttons. You can actually just kind of engage with it verbally, and that's before we get into other stuff. It's kind of like medicine. Next big challenge is, how do we help your iPhone, not just become a nice tool for dealing with your doctor, but become integral with, your physical and emotional health?
Totally agreed. This is where this is all coming full circle. Yeah.
Yes. Without having to plumb you up internally with things that are just watches.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had, 3 of my friends have surgeries. I mean, one thing old people talk about all the time is their health. I got pacemakers in me and heart defibrillators and blah 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 blah. Not funny, but it is true.
It is true.
But dealing with that and having technology being able to help and monitor it. So a friend of mine's got a defibrillator and a monitor tied to her phone, so they could actually kind of track making sure she's okay. And she's my age. She's not that old.
Right.
And so how do we how do we do that?
These well are the big innovations that are coming, right? That are really going to help everybody.
I was on a project a couple of years ago, a short-term project to kind of help them get into the cloud space, but they were dealing with young people, autistic kids.
Yeah.
It was a leveraging tool for billing with the professionals, but the next step was, how do we help the parents? How do we help better engage the professionals who know how to deal with autism and kids and that kind of thing? Because the whole autistic spectrum is, quite a challenge. And try to
it's vastly different depending on where they are in the spectrum, right? And so the degree of help they need, right, will vary.
And educating the parents, because here they are freaking out because, oh my God, my kid's autistic, and we're learning more about it. We're finding out most people are autistic. My babbling right now probably has me on one end of the spectrum anyway. But how to sort of make it easier to educate,
Yeah.
that the parents, and then on top of that, I've been on the school board over here at Pritzker Elementary for 25 years. Well, okay, what's the biggest challenge that public education has these days? Well, when I joined 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, the biggest challenge was a quarter of the kids were showing up not having any breakfast.
Right.
Okay, well, guess what? We're now serving food to anybody who shows up. It was a
Right.
big debate back then. Who should pay for it? Well,
Right.
okay, 80% of the kids going to Pritzker at the time were technically homeless. Okay,
Right.
poverty kids. That's down to 17%. But the challenge was, the existential conversation with the community on what we felt was our responsibility in a larger scale, not just the parents and their own kids, but
Right.
their peers and their
Right.
classmates and whatnot.
But the community
And
as a
so that,
whole, and what's our bigger
yeah,
responsibility, right? Yeah.
yeah. And so we started basically, um, it was quite a debate. I've sat there for several hours debating over this, but we basically started saying free breakfasts for anybody who shows up. And
Yeah.
suddenly everyone starts showing up at 7:30 in the morning to have breakfast to start school at 8:30 in the morning.
So now
And then,
that's the big challenge then. Now what's the big challenge today?
well, the challenge after feeding everybody was the police on campus thing. If you want another existential conversation, we'll get into that one.
It's a whole
But
nother can of
the
worms.
one, I was at these mixed schools, and this was back in the day. How do we use the technology in a productive way so that
Yeah.
some privacy is observed and maintained, so we don't have
Yeah.
everybody's business kind of stuck out there? I mean,
Right.
the biggest challenge dealing with social workers is, do we really want them to know what's going on between mom and dad and stuff? Because everyone's marriage has always got challenges, and
Right.
sometimes mom's crazy and dad's stressed, or
Yeah.
mom's dealing with kids that are hyperactive or
Yeah. All kinds.
whatever.
Yeah, you're right.
There's all kinds of dynamics, and sometimes you need help, sometimes you don't want help,
Yeah.
sometimes you just want people to stay in their lane and out of your business because you're
Yeah.
having a hard time coping, and other times you kind of want some help but you don't know how to ask.
You don't have
So
to ask, right?
and so there are all those kinds of challenges. I mean,
Yeah.
one of them is my blended family, for example. One of the things that I learned from Steve, aside from just a higher vision on technology, was that Steve's vision of teaching kids computers was something really big in his heart.
Yeah.
Because aside from being an orphan and realizing he was a hand-me-down kid, the other thing that he also understood was that if you want to be the next generation's prime market, you need
Yeah.
to get into the kids' heads today. So if
And
you
they
remember,
did
the Apple
that.
computers,
Yeah.
were initially targeted in the elementary schools. Remember the old
Absolutely.
Apple
It's
computers,
how
the
you get that
Macintoshes and all that?
generation. Yeah. Yeah. Using them. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, in fact, the first school in the Midwest was Pritzker Elementary. I hooked up a data circuit over there so we could actually bring up a
Yeah.
classroom up on the internet back in the day. And it was like, wow, very innovative. So taking that to the next level of can we put computers in the classrooms? Because I was teaching Boy Scouts back in the day. I was bringing in these high schoolers to put in front of computers when I was at Sun, then at Next, to get kids' hands on computers, led to things like one of my kids building the first website for the Chicago Public Schools. So if you go up on the Wayback Machine to archive.org to the old
Find it,
cps.fg
right?
website,
Yeah.
you're going to find a very rudimentary looking website written by my 16-year-old kid from my youth group that he put together with one of his mentors
It's
at Chicago Public
fantastic.
Schools.
Yeah.
And it was like the first website for a public school.
And where is he today?
He's at Amazon,
Yeah.
basically running sort of the Apple division at Amazon. these
Amazon,
days.
right? See, and that's the thing that people need to see. Like, how you doing? You gave him a hand up and gave him the tools, and now look, that's what happens.
Well, the other thing that happened during that time, because I was teaching computers downtown at the Embassy Tower with the invite of all the high schoolers from the Boy Scouts. The other thing, moving into this neighborhood that I was in, I ended up meeting a bunch of the kids from the neighborhood around. And so I started inviting them because there's a lot of public housing in the Wicker Park area that I was at. And I started meeting some of the kids around here. And so I started bringing them downtown to Embassy Tower, and we spent a couple of 3 hours. And I had an interesting problem with the nerd versus the gangbanger, with these kids. So I had the nerds from the Boy Scouts, and I had the gangbangers from my hood, having this sort of detente issue going on between the two of them until they eventually all chilled out and all started liking each other. But that was
I love that
an
you did that.
example.
Yeah, it's a great example.
But there was an
Yeah.
example of the cultural divide that sometimes you run into. And here I
Yeah.
am, a pretty white guy who basically moved into a hood neighborhood and trying to teach, computers to high schoolers who never had hands on it, as well as bringing the gangbangers in to teach computers as well. And next thing you know, I got a kid who's from the hood putting up the first website on the planet for a school system.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I know we only have just a minute or two left, but I want you to tell me how many kids have come through your program this way.
Well, from there, I also ended up taking in kids here in Wicker Park. I became legal guardian of this one young man. His mom was a crack addict, sadly, and he came crying at my door, 6 a.m, had no place to go. Took him to his mom, took him to his aunties, and I thought, why can't I help this kid? Why does he have to kind of go off to family? And so I talked to one of my 5 lawyers I had at the time and became his legal guardian. Long story short, sad tale. He got framed for a shooting back when young black kids got framed for shootings by cops to make
which
money.
is a shame.
But anyway, when he got arrested, I had like 3 of his friends immediately say, "Oh, Cal, we're moving in." And from there, I end up I got about 24 kids over like 30 years came through.
That's amazing. It's amazing.
Four of my gals own houses. I had one that was at the Oscars with Meryl Streep a few years ago.
Really
when
cool.
Meryl Streep was up there trash talking our president at the time, Mr. Orange, they were panning the audience with people's expressions. And my goddaughter was in the audience sitting there giving a very studious look at Meryl Streep as she was, giving this, lecture about democracy and all this kind of stuff. As she was living in my basement, a few years earlier, and now she is in Hollywood.
Yeah, there she is in Hollywood, right?
Yeah, she's Jane the Virgin.
See, and those are the kind of stories that continue to need to be told. And Cal, I love that you're doing this and that you've done this throughout the years and that you've had these success. And again, it shows what a big heart you have.
Well, one of the things.
Go ahead.
The other thing I want to kind of also stick in your ear is we need men to engage more with young people. Because one of the challenges when I was growing up, it wasn't so hard to find somebody running a Boy Scout troop or whatever. But that's kind of declined over the last 20 years. And so my backup message is, how do we encourage young men to kind of get back into teaching, kids
and mentoring
more teachers?
Right. Kids need a hand up. You're right. You're exactly right. Please tell everyone that is watching this and wants to understand more about your mobile apps how to get in touch. We'll put all the links below, but tell them how to get in touch with you.
Come to audrency.com, Audrey Inc., which is named after my mom, Audrey Inc., or go to LinkedIn and look up Cal Thixton. One of the kids that I had back in the day is running LinkedIn, by the way. If you get to brag about Dan Grillo, he's VP of engineering there. Another product of Steve and sort of my taking in young people to go off and do cool stuff.
Really
aside
cool.
From the Amazon kid and, my kid, running CPS at that time. Sponsor of, the whole idea is identifying smart young people to go off and do amazing things when they get older. Yeah. I got Dan running LinkedIn. I got Ricardo running Amazon and Paul running Amazon.
I love it. And you know what? We're going to have you back, Cal, because we just couldn't get it all in this one. But I love it. And it's fantastic. Yeah. So we'll have all the links below when this goes live. But Cal, thank you for sharing all of your journey, your history, really cool stories you have, but also for what you did with these kids and giving them a hand up and a leg up. I honestly, it's inspiring, and I hope more people look to do the same.
They inspire me more than...
It's always the case, right?
It's now my purpose. I'm the old man from their point of view.
But you gave back, and I think that's the important thing. And that's really great. Really
Thank
great.
You.
Cal, thank you so much. And that wraps up this episode of Future Proof. And we thank Cal for all of his insights. And we will see you guys on the next episode. Thanks, Cal.
You forgot my Steve Jobs turtleneck, by the way.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Bye, Brett.
If you're ready to embrace change and lead with innovation, be sure to subscribe and never miss an episode. Thanks for tuning in to the Future Proof Podcast.